chapter number 4. Ecclesiastes chapter number 4. I have to say tonight's message, or text, I would say message, text, it's probably one of the hardest texts I think I've ever had to study. I'm just telling you, it was difficult. On the surface, I didn't see it to be so difficult until I started trying to pull it apart and understand what was being said. There are a few of them like that in the Bible that are just really, really hard to figure out what's being said. And this was one of them because it has multiple ways it can go in the way it can be understood. And everybody had their opinion of the way it's supposed to be understood. So made it a little difficult, but I think we got it down got it down today, and hopefully it'll be a blessing to all of us. So let's look at verse 1 again, just to kind of recount, because they are all flowing together, even though they seem like individual thoughts, and they can be understood that way. It is meant in one theme here of the world is not worth living for. It's not worth holding on to. And again, that's what we see here. So look what verse 1 says. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. Again I considered all travail and every right work, that for this a man is envied of his neighbor. This is also vanity and vexation of spirit. The fool foldeth his hands together and eateth his own flesh. Better is an handful with quietness than both the hands full with travail and vexation of spirit. Then I returned and saw vanity under the sun. There is one alone, and there is not a second. Yea, he hath neither child nor brother, yet is there no end of all his labor. Neither is his eye satisfied with riches. Neither saith he, for whom do I labor and bereave my soul of good? This is also vanity, yea, it is a sore travail. Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor. For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. Again, if two lie together, then they have heat, but how can one be warm alone? And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken. Now here's where the troublesome text is, verse 13. Better is a poor and wise child from an old, or more, read it again. Better is a poor and wise child than an old and foolish king, who will no more be admonished. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. I considered all the living which walk under the sun, with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. We've been talking about over the last few weeks in this passage, this chapter, that Solomon isn't really throwing a bunch of random ideas in here, but really pulling back and showing how that the world that we live in is not a world that brings happiness, doesn't bring joy. And part of the way in which he has demonstrated that is to give us a few examples of that in different parts of the way human beings act. And one of them has to do with that we talked about the first week when we were here in chapter 4, was the fact that we live in a world that's full of hopelessness and oppression. And he talked about there that people are victimized by others who have power, and they cannot do anything to stop that. They live under the oppression, and Solomon joins in with his response to basically say, I feel your pain, and I wish, in some sense, if I was under your pain, that I would feel in this sense of hopelessness, desiring death more than life, wishing that I had never been born rather than to live in these days, and even pitying those who will be born and come to this place and experience what a horrible life we can live in. And again, Solomon's point is, if you think you're going to find happiness in a world that's broken like this, think again. And then, again, the second example he gave was that the world is also full of travail and also bad thinking when it comes to people's idea of work. And in verses 4 to 6, he talks about one person living his life full of endless travail, trying to ascend the corporate ladder, trying to reach the top, doing so while wearing himself out to utter exhaustion, and involved in that is this fierce competition, even hatred, bitterness, envy that plays out in all of that, trying to work their way to the top, showing everyone else or shoving everyone else down while they work their way up. And he says, and all it results in, when you even reach the top, is vanity and vexation of spirit. It's trying to catch the wind and never catching it. And then he looked to the other extreme. You got the guy who lives that way, trying to work his way up the ladder, and then he goes to the other side, and the guy who's absolutely lazy, the shameful, lazy one, and he says this guy's just as bad on the opposite because it has its own consequences, and he says he folds his hands and devours his own flesh. And in a sense, a way of saying is that it also has consequences to live that way. One is it wears you out and brings nothing but travail in your life, and the other literally brings you to desperation because you waste every opportunity to make any kind of a living for yourself, and then you have nothing and end up basically destroying yourself because of it. And so he gives his advice to that is to seek to be contented. Have one handful rather than two. Have one handful with quietness rather than two with travail. And that obviously is good advice for the man who thinks he's got to work himself up to the top. And it's also good advice for the person who thinks he shouldn't work at all. Because you need to work to take care of your needs, and you don't need to work to the point that you make your life all about trying to reach the top, which is empty. And so that's, again, the argument he's making, that you can't find happiness in this world because that is the mindset of this world, and that's not where happiness is found. And the third one that we talked about was last week's. We talked about the greedy man, and he kind of fits similar to the last one, but this one, as I illustrated last week, was the guy who's a lot like the Ebenezer Scrooge, who works for every last penny, trying to squeeze out as much money he can make with his life, and there's no end of all his labor. His eye's not satisfied with what he makes, which is why he never stops doing what he does. And the worst thing about the man's life is that he never takes the time to consider, why am I doing what I'm doing? Because I have no family, I have no children that I'm providing for, I'm completely selfish, and I'm not even satisfying myself with my selfishness. And he's saying that basically that's the argument here that a lot of people live. He stays locked into this vanity and vexation of spirit. And he says the solution to that selfishness is what we argued in the next part there, was that you give your life to other people. You bind your life to other people, and not only will you begin to benefit other people, you yourself will receive benefit from it. And he gave a few examples of that, how that they benefit you. There's this kind of mutual benefiting one another. And again, that's the argument. You can't live like the world lives or hold to the things that the world holds to and find happiness. You have to find it the other way. You have to find it in contentedness. You have to find it in giving your life to others, and thus finding not only benefit but happiness in the middle of that. Now the last one we're going to look at here, here Solomon is describing a world full of, I would say, forgetfulness and pride. Forgetfulness and pride. I tried to come up with some words that kind of make sense to the whole understanding of what he's talking about here. Forgetfulness, by the way, is a theme that Solomon has talked about a few times already in our study here in Ecclesiastes. In chapter 1, we saw it in verses 9 through 11, where he said this, "The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be. And that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new? It hath been already of old time, which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. In other words, basically what he's arguing is there's nothing truly new under the sun. The world works in this cyclical pattern, and that keeps showing up as well as a theme that he uses over and over. And mankind, in the way he operates, also is cyclical. Cyclical. And when man thinks that he has stumbled upon or created something or now is in a place of something that he thinks is new, it really is not new. It's just something old that's been rewrapped in shiny, decorative, flashy wrapping paper. But the essence of the thing that's under the paper is still old. It's still old. It's not new at all. It's something of old that has come back on the scene again. And part of the reason why things are the way they are in this kind of cyclical thing is that man simply forgets what has already happened. One generation comes on the scene, forgets the operations of a former generation. They forget the lessons of that former generation. They forget the troubles of that former generation, and thus they think their generation is unique to all of human history. And thus they repeat history all over again, thinking that somehow they have all the problems of life figured out that those previous generations never did figure out. And again, Solomon's argument is nothing is new under the sun. Then you go to chapter 3, and we saw this recently back in verse 14 and 15, and he alludes to that idea again. He says, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. And there we see Solomon, again, speaking in the broader context here of how God works in the world. In the previous verses, he's talked about how man really cannot find out the beginning from the end. God does not always make things clear for man to fully understand what is happening in the world. And I said it earlier when we were in that passage that it's like God is weaving together a tapestry, and we only see the underside of the tapestry, and we see all the threads of material being woven back and forth, but we don't see the picture it's creating, but God sees it from the other side. And then Solomon said in verse 14 that we are not in control of what's going on. We can't make God do what we want him to do. There's no adding to his plans or taking away from his plans. You can't change his plans. Even prayer doesn't change his plans unless it's within his plans that your prayer is going to change it. You understand that? If he's so worked it that way, that it's a way of saying that God, basically what Solomon is saying is that you are not God, he is. And he can do what he wants, and he doesn't have to answer to us. And then he made this statement in verse 15, that which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. And again, here he says, God works in cycles. And the reason why everything seems to keep repeating itself over and over and over is because the one who's running everything is running it in cycles. Mankind continually forgets that. He thinks that he has discovered that which is new, or that time that he's living in, or that age that he's living in is unique to his time or unique to the world's history, but the circumstances are not unique. Wake up. You're just part of the cycle, is what he's saying. Think about it here, of what's going on in our own world at this point. And I'm just going to be clear, we've got bad leaders in our country making all sorts of bad policies that are hurting the people of our own country financially, shutting down our own pipeline that produces enough oil to supply our needs, plus send to other countries around the world. And instead of choosing to fund the building of a foreign pipeline, instead of funding ours, we choose to fund or allow for the building of a foreign pipeline of a pariah nation called Russia to provide fuel for other countries in Europe and us. And because of these corrupt policies, the gas prices have skyrocketed, which I was mentioning earlier before the service. And instead of listening to what the people are saying and say, stop buying their oil and open up our own pipelines, they ignore it. And then to add to it, there's a war that's going on. It's been now 2 weeks going on in Europe. And a lot of that has been funded by our own buying of that oil from Russia. And now the people of Ukraine are begging that we get involved, or begging that we send them all sorts of things, weapons, planes, other kinds of things to help fight this battle. And we've done everything we can to pull away from that, to almost show that we're cowardly. We helped create the problem, and yet we're backing out from helping in the problem as it goes on. And really, I think how shameful our country must appear to this world that's watching. Now, let me ask you a question. Is this the first time that something like this has happened in world history, where a nation made wrong choices that led other nations to hurt? No. Or is it the first time in world history where leaders have been cowardly and not taken responsibility for their own actions? No. And what's adding to it is the fact that even now we've said we've stopped buying their oil, but now we're going to buy it from some other nation that doesn't even want to answer the phone. It's shameful. It's utterly shameful when we have the solution right here in our own country. But again, I want to make the point, not to be political. It just bothers me, and it bothers me a lot. And it's one thing if it doesn't affect me, maybe it doesn't bother me as much, but when it affects everybody and it hurts everybody, some of you travel 30 minutes, 40 minutes to come to church. I know that you feel that pain. And yet, the point here is that nothing is new. We're not living in a time that is unique to world history where we see things like this happening. This is how it always works. You have nations that keep doing the same thing and people that keep doing the same thing, and God keep working through the same thing over and over and over, and it will be like that till Jesus comes. And I'm not looking at what's going on in Europe and saying, I think we're at the very end of the times, because this is not the only time it's happened. This is not the only time that the world has gone into chaos because of stupid decisions that nations have made. I'd say there are some unique things about it, but it's not unique in the sense that it's new. You understand what I'm saying? Solomon's been making that point all the way through the book, that this is how the world is. The world's broken. And men have a tendency to forget their history, to forget how God works, to think that somehow they have stumbled onto something that's brand new, or that they are experiencing something new that no other people have ever experienced before. When again, Solomon's answer, nothing is new under the sun. Life will continue to work this way, again, as I said, until Jesus comes. This is part of being in a broken world. And again, maybe the argument to go all the way to the point is, if you think you're going to find happiness in this broken world, you're mistaken. You're mistaken. This is not a world that's meant to make us happy. So here's the point we want to get to now. Solomon is now dealing with, in this little passage here, the cyclical nature of leaders rising and falling. Rising and falling. Bad leaders, good leaders. Bad leaders, good leaders. Bad leaders, good leaders. And he's making the point here that it's just like how everything else works. It works in this cyclical pattern, and yet people forget that it works in that pattern. Doesn't mean that you're going to have always a good leader after a bad leader, or always a bad leader after a good leader, or so. We don't have that promise that it's going to work exactly that way. But the point that Solomon is making, and kind of give you the sort of the outline of this passage that he's making, is that people enjoy the times when there are good leaders. They rejoice over the times when there are good leaders. Good leaders become popular and wanted and even almost kind of worshipped in the way they are treated. And then when a new generation comes on the scene, the new leader that was so wonderful and great is now an old leader, and that new generation wants new leaders. And popularity dies of that first person. And Solomon goes to the same statement he makes at the end of almost everything. This is vanity and vexation of spirit. In other words, saying popularity doesn't last. People's viewpoints of people doesn't last. When a new generation comes on the scene, that viewpoint changes, right? And so that's kind of the argument here he makes. Now, let me now dive into the actual text and look at it a little more specifically. Go down to verse 13. And here he's going to give us some contrast between two people. Look at verse 13. He says, better is a poor and a wise child than an old and foolish king who will no more be admonished. Now Solomon is sort of taking a parabolic contrast between these two people. This is not any one person or any one event or any one situation that we can say we know he's talking about this event in history. He's just making a, kind of like Jesus did, telling a story that does relate reality. That does relate reality of what goes on. And here he is saying that one of the things we see here is a contrast between is one, you got one is considered a child and one is an old man. Now, one is absolutely new, the child, when it comes to how things work. The word child here doesn't necessarily mean kid or, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, something like that. It can be, it's meant to be contrasting to the idea of the fact that the man is old. The word can also be translated young man. It could be used to describe someone who's in his early teens, even into early 20s, if we want to look at it from that perspective. But the point of what he's making here is that this young child, this young man, is inexperienced when it comes to how the world works. He may not know all the ins and outs when it comes to leading a nation, when it comes to leading a kingdom. He's not a politician. He doesn't know how to deal with politicians, maybe. He may not even know how you make policy. He may not understand how you execute judgments. He may not know how you deal with foreign nations. He's young and inexperienced. The contrast is this king here who apparently, by the way Solomon is describing, has been a king for a long time. He has lots of experience when it comes to leadership. He has been ruling as a king for years and years and years. He knows all the ins and outs when it comes to holding his position of power. He knows what to do and what not to do as a king. He knows how to deal with foreign leaders. He's dealt with situations that only those in his position would even be familiar with. He has much experience. That's the first contrast between the two. One's inexperienced, one is experienced. The second contrast we see there is that the fact that he mentions the fact that one is poor, and by implication, being the king, the other one is rich. The child knows what it's like to live at the bottom of life's barrel. He grows up in poverty. We see that found in verse 14, I'm sorry. His circumstances of life have not been favorable to him. In fact, in verse 14, it even says that he has been even in prison at one point. We're not given the details. We're not given why he was in prison. We have no circumstances told to us. But the point that Solomon is saying, again, this is just a generic story meant to create a real life situation here. The point he's making is that this man understands hardship, in contrast to what the other one wouldn't. He understands what it's like to live in poverty. He understands how people feel living in poverty. He understands how people feel who might be abused by those who are not in poverty. But on the other hand, the king, living in a place of wealth and honor, he's on the opposite side of the spectrum of this man's life. It's very possible that this king has no idea what it's like to be poor. apparently by even what Solomon seems to be saying, this man inherited his throne, not got it or received it through some kind of means. He got it because his dad was king, and he's grown up in this place of royalty, this place of wealth. He's grown up, as you've heard people say, with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he's always had plenty. He doesn't know the same things that this young man knows. Third contrast we're given is about these two people is that one has a humble heart and the other one doesn't. And again, it's by implication we see that. He says, he calls in verse 13, the poor child, he calls him a poor and wise child, and he calls here the king, he calls him foolish, who will no more be admonished. What makes the child wise? Well, while the old king is described as foolish here, we can understand in this sense that he's described as foolish because he won't take admonishment. The word admonishment there means to be enlightened or be taught or to be warned. He's not able to be instructed. So the opposite, then talking about what makes this one wise, is that obviously he's teachable. He's teachable. He's able to take instruction from somebody else. He's able to listen to counselors around him. He has this attitude that he doesn't know everything and that he doesn't understand everybody. And he doesn't know all the contingencies of people's lives, and he needs to hear everybody's vantage point. That's his viewpoint. That's this young, wise child. On the other hand, the king is completely opposite of that. He's been there for so long, he's settled in his ways, that he's too proud to listen to anybody that might try to impart to him wisdom, instruction, warning, enlightenment. He doesn't, in his mind, need anybody's help to be king. He knows how to be king. He knows better than those dumb people that he is over. He's not teachable. And the point that Solomon is making is that even though these two people are on the opposite sides of the spectrum, the young poor man, he says, is on better terms when it comes to being a leader over the people than the present king is now, who has had years and years of experience when it comes to it, being king. The young man understands life from the lowest of places, while this lifelong king couldn't possibly understand it because he's never been in it. And nor does he, by appearance, truly even care. He's out of touch with his people. He couldn't and wouldn't care for them in the least. And this young man, because of his youth, was not so set in his ways, so he could be teachable. He's directly contrasted with the king in his character. The king was a terrible king because he was unteachable, an unteachable man who was out of touch with the people he ruled over, while the other man knows what those people are feeling and thus can be taught. And again, not to be political, though I may be a little again, think about it from this perspective. When most of our nation is begging the President of the United States to start pumping oil, to stop funding the war machine in Russia, because the prices at our own pumps are causing incredible inflation everywhere else, he ignores these people because they're dumb and don't know what they're talking about, and instead seeks to buy oil from Iran or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, enemy nations to our country, who have been openly enemy nations to our country. And by the way, just to give you a little more insight, Joe Biden has been the president for a year, but he's been in public office for 51 years. And not only does he have a terrible record those 51 years of being in public office, he continually demonstrates to this day he's much like this king who is unteachable when it comes to caring for the needs of the people he's over. And that's why Solomon is saying that this poor young man is on better grounds when it comes to being a leader than this king who's been in that position of power for so long and he won't be taught. So, now the parable moves on. Look what he says in verse 14. For out of prison he cometh to reign, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. Now this is where things start taking a turn for the difficult interpretations. But I'm not going to give you all the crazy interpretations that I read and studied through. I'm going to do my best to kind of give you what I think it's probably saying. Now, there's two possible views on what can be said in this, and it's only because I'm looking for a little bit of the details and trying to pull pieces together here. Possibly one can be that Solomon may be referring to, one being a young revolutionary. Out of prison he comes to reign. Now again, we're not given the details about his incarceration. We're not told why he's there, but maybe Solomon could be alluding to somebody that might be some bit of a revolutionary that came out of prison and was able to amass a following and put down or depose the king that's in his position of power. And it's possible that if that is the case, that this young man may have been imprisoned because he was considered a political enemy. And again, I'm telling you, these are not in the text. I'm reading into it a little bit, okay? He was not for the king. He was one who did not go along with the bad policies of the king. He was unwilling, though, to be silent, publicly calling out the king for all his evils and his insensitivities to his people. The king dishonored his people, burdened his people with unnecessary laws, harassed his people, and continued to wear them down. And I guess that you can say is somewhat implied in what he says, that he's not able to be admonished. I would say this young man, if that's the viewpoint we want to look at it, or that Solomon is taking it from, that this young man could have been like in Elijah, the prophet, who boldly and openly called out the king for the things he did that were wrong. Or a Jehu who went after Ahab and his family when he was now given the authority to be the king. Maybe this young man has been imprisoned for something like that, standing against the king publicly. And when he's finally freed from that prison, there were enough people who knew what he did and are willing to join with him for his cause, and thus they're able to overthrow the king. That's possible. That's not said in the text. Okay, so you understand that that's Sperling translation. Okay? Possibly, though, it could be that this is a veiled reference to someone like a Joseph, who out of prison comes to reign. You know Joseph's story, right? Out of the Bible, where he was accused or falsely accused by Potiphar's wife and thus was thrown in prison. And while they're in prison, he meets Pharaoh's butler and baker, who apparently are there because they're suspected of treason against the king or against the Pharaoh. And one day Joseph is able to interpret both their dreams, one to his demise, another to his return back to his office. And it was that wisdom that Joseph seems to have, this young man that Joseph seems to have, that allows him to later have an audience with the Pharaoh when the Pharaoh has his own dream that he can't seem to solve. And because he's able to interpret the dream, Pharaoh makes him second in power over the nation of Egypt. Out of prison, he comes to reign. And so the point here that Solomon is making, whether it be a revolutionary or it be something like a Joseph or somebody in between with some other set of circumstances that I did not give you, the point he's saying here is that he shouldn't be in the position of power, but he is. He's been given this position of power. He's gone from the lowest of places now to the highest of places. And whatever the details are that Solomon doesn't allow us to know, we are given only to guess about them. We can see the fact that this young man doesn't seem like the person that would ever be in that spot, yet Solomon says he deserves it more than the guy who's in it. And eventually he gets it. And so then we see the deposing of that first king. Look at verse 14 again. He says, whereas also he that is born in his kingdom becometh poor. And this is, at this point, if it is an allusion to Joseph becoming high leader in the land of Egypt, this is obviously where that allusion breaks down, because this king doesn't stay king. This king is removed. It says that, describing him, that the one that was born in his kingdom, the one who was king from birth or king from raised to this position, is now brought to a place of poverty. He's made poor. He loses his throne. He's no longer in the position of power and wealth. It's now the young man's turn to reign. And in wisdom, he now rules the nation. The abuses of the former king are now over. And this king is a humble king, as we saw. He's willing to listen to the people. He understands the people because at one point he himself was there. He himself was in that position of poverty. He himself was in that position of weakness, maybe even in that position of being abused by a tyrant king. He knew what it was like to suffer. He knew the pain. He didn't just say, I feel your pain and don't have any experience with it. He had plenty of experience. That was his whole life. And so as a result, this king receives the acceptance and praise of his people. They love him. They rejoice over him. They treat him as the savior of the nation. And that's the point that Solomon is talking about. That's what Solomon is bringing it out. And everybody now at this point, and he's going to argue that in just a second, everybody at this point is singing his praises. Everybody is united to him. Everybody is willing to follow him because he is a popular, wonderful king. And that's the point he's making. But now Solomon argues the case, what we could call the vanity of popularity. The vanity of popularity, and that's found in these next two verses, verse 15 and 16. Look what he says. I considered all the living which walk under the sun with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before him. Now, at one point, you have the foolish king, verse 13. Very unpopular in the eyes of the people. He's unteachable. He's abusive toward his people, takes advantage of them with his power. They're not able to defend themselves, much like we saw in the oppressors in chapter 4 at the very beginning. And then comes this poor, young, wise leader on the scene. Solomon calls him in verse 15 the second child, which stands up in the stead of the first. No, he didn't have a lot of experience. But he did have a few things that the other one didn't. He was poor, which turns out to be a benefit. He understood the difficulties of life, having himself been in prison. He had a wise and a teachable heart, unlike this former king. He was young compared to this old king, which meant he wasn't set in his ways, one. Two, he probably had vitality that this other one did not have. He had youthful strength, and he was ready to accomplish great things on behalf of the people, like a young leader would be. And because of those qualities, he's able to rise to power, depose the former king, and now he's the most popular person in the world, at least to those people that are his subjects. And in verse 15 and 16 talks about how the people join themselves to this new king. Look at verse 15. He says, I considered all the living which walk under the sun with the second child that shall stand up in his stead. The key word there is with, meaning they have their hearts joined with him. They are for him. They love him. Like David, they sing his praises in the street. And in verse 16, Solomon talks about how they are for his king. He says, there is no end of all the people. Meaning there are crowds upon crowds upon crowds of people who love this king. And as I said, they see this young man as a savior of the world, or at least the savior of their nation. Again, maybe to give you a little bit of a thing that's going on in our own time, I think about the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. How instead of running away when his country was being invaded, you see him staying there to fight. And almost every time you look at him now, he's in fatigues. Looks like he hasn't shaven. Looks like he's worn out and tired, which I imagine he absolutely is, but it's that boldness and courage that this man has that has united all of Ukraine to him. And not just all of Ukraine, many other nations to him. I think that's kind of what this person that Solomon is describing is like to the people. He's describing a person that, a nobody who has risen to power. He's put an end to the horrible reign of a foolish king, and now everybody loves him. And then he says here, look at this phrase in verse number 16. He says, even of all that have been before them. Now, it's not talking about time, referring to before their time, but rather it's talking about the king's position to his people. The people are before their king, or rather, he is before them all. He is going in and out before them, ruling and guiding and leading them, and they are willing to follow him as he leads, wherever he leads. He's popular, he's loved, he's embraced, he's followed. You can't get any better than being the most popular man in the world at this point. That's the point that Solomon is trying to raise us to that climax. To help us see a man who's a nobody. We always love those stories, the underdog stories, where the nobody rises to power. I think, in my opinion, I feel that way for Ukraine. I want to see Ukraine whip Russia's rear end. I want to see that. I don't know all their motives. I don't know everybody's backstories, but I want to see the underdog win. You know what I'm talking about? And we're like that. At least I'm like that. I love to hear about those kinds of stories. And that's what Solomon is trying to describe. The underdog rises to power and everybody loves him. But then all of a sudden in verse 16, things change. Look at verse 16. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. I thought everybody loved him. The reign of this king was so bright and so glorious, it suddenly takes a turn for the worse. Now, not suddenly to him, but suddenly in the verse, it changes. Like the previous generation, this new generation would desire someone new to fill the spot of this once popular king. Maybe the reason why they want this new king, or they want someone else, they're not rejoicing in this once popular king, is because maybe he's now old and set in his ways, like the previous one was. Maybe the power that he has as king and the popularity that he has and the power connected to that popularity that he has gone to his head, and he thinks himself much bigger than he really is. And he's no longer teachable. He's no longer willing to follow the good advice of those around him. And maybe he's even beginning to forget what it's like to be poor, what it's like to be abused by wicked tyrants. And he himself begins to be one. And nobody can stop him with his, in some sense, unlimited power that he has gained from not only being king, but from being popular as one. That's a possibility. We have examples of kings doing these very things throughout the Old Testament. They start off good and godly kings, and eventually they replace horrible kings and ungodly kings, and then at a certain point in their reign, they just turn, they flop, they flip. And so the people begin to cry out for a new leader to take this king's place. The one that they sang his praises, now they don't want him. Solomon, I think, would be a very good example of that in some way. Obviously, he didn't replace a bad king, but he was a good king that would turn bad, and to the point that when he finally dies, is the people, the leaders of the land, come and ask his son not to be as rough as he was, not to be as harsh and overtaxing as he was. Uzziah is a good example of one of those kings that was considered a good and godly king, defended his people, loved his people, cared for his people, saved his people from their enemies, and then at a certain point he was lifted up with pride and he thought he could do what only the priest could do and go in and offer incense on the golden altar. And after being pushed away, he still came in and stuck his hand out to put some kind of an incense on the altar and was made a leper because of it. Joash, or Jehoash as he's called, starts off as a good king. He's a king at a very early age. All his siblings were killed by his mother, or mother, I guess grandmother, who wanted to be king or queen, Athaliah. And he gets hidden away, and then eventually he is declared king by the help of the high priest and the priest of the temple, and becomes a very good king for quite a while until the high priest dies, and then resorts to being an evil king. That could be the reason why people would refuse to join with him now. They don't rejoice over him anymore because he's failed to be what he once was. It's possible. But I want to make a note, just like we've done all the way through this passage right here, Solomon doesn't give us those notes. He doesn't tell us those details. He doesn't tell us why the next generation doesn't like him. Now, it could be simply, like generations of people are, new people just want new things. They don't want someone who's a has-been. They don't want a guy who's been there forever on the throne. They want someone young, which was one of the benefits he was when he became the king, right? He was young as opposed to this old guy. They want someone fresh, someone with vitality, someone with more charisma, somebody who can excite them. And what Solomon is making the point here is this man who once was popular is no longer popular. His popularity has died. That's a sad thing, isn't it? People who deserve it, deserve the honor, deserve the praise, it just doesn't stay with them. It might be for a short time. You might have done something grand and wonderful. Later on, Solomon's going to talk about somebody through his wisdom delivered a city by his wisdom, delivered a city from their enemies, and everybody forgot who it was that did it. Over time, was forgotten. And Solomon's famous conclusion that he always comes to at the end of these things is that this is vanity and vexation of spirit. It's an empty pursuit that comes up with nothing. But what's he talking about it being an empty pursuit? The point he's making is the pursuit of popularity. It's a vain pursuit. Some pursue wealth to find happiness. Some pursue power to find happiness. Solomon pursued all of that plus pleasure and everything else to find happiness. And some even pursue men's applause to find happiness. Popularity. And what we learn from this point is that popularity comes and goes as people's interest comes and goes. If you're going to make a big splash into the world and get everybody's attention, just expect the splash is not going to last. You might come on the stage in a grand entrance of life like this young child did. It might even be hailed as the Savior of the world because of what you've done or who you've defeated. You might even have a great following where there's multitudes to the point that it's endless with how many people were following you and how many people loved you. You might have had people who are willing to follow you to the ends of the world for a time. But just remember that popularity will not last forever. Eventually, a new generation will come on the scene that doesn't know anything about you, nor cares. Because people traditionally forget. Even when we know, we forget, don't we? They want somebody else. His glory days are gone. And by the way, this isn't, as I said, a one-time event. This is a parable to teach a reality that goes on all the time. It doesn't only go on with kings. It doesn't only go on with leaders, though it does quite often. It goes on with everybody who has some kind of a position of power, who has some kind of an accomplishment in life, that they get honored for a short time, but the spotlight is not forever. You don't get to live in the spotlight all the days of your life. Even people who did great and wonderful things don't get to live in the spotlight forever. And as generations go on, it's like the spotlight not only moves away, a dark light comes on them sometimes. And people begin to see you in a wrong way at times, not all the time. The point Solomon is saying is, if you think the world is about you finding happiness, you're not going to find it. You're not going to find it. This is the way people think it works, but they forget that it doesn't bring happiness. It will disappoint you. You might revel in the glory for the time, but it will disappoint you when it's gone. The world is full of oppression. The world is full of greed and selfishness. The world is full of wrong ideas on how to find happiness. Happiness, get this, comes when we make our lives about fearing God, keeping His commandments, choosing to rejoice in His goodness, His goodnesses that He pours out on you daily. I have a Thanksgiving list that I pull out. And I do that to remind myself of the fact that God has been so good to my life so many times over, and sometimes I forget to be thankful. But you know where I find joy shows up? When I start counting those blessings and remembering just how good He has been to me. And you know, joy comes, as Solomon also said here in chapter 4, when we make our lives about others, not about ourselves. Russell Conwell told of an ancient Persian named Ali Hafed who owned a very large farm and had orchards, grain fields, and gardens. Ali was a wealthy and content man. One day, Ali entertained a guest who told him all about diamonds and how wealthy he would be if he owned a diamond mine. Ali Hafed, let me say it right, went to bed that night a poor man, poor only because he was discontented. Craving a mine of diamonds, he sold his farm to search for the rare stones. He traveled the world over, finally becoming so poor, broken, and defeated that he committed suicide. One day, the man who purchased Ali Hafed's farm led his camel into the garden to drink. As his camel put his nose into the brook, the man saw a flash of light from the sands of the stream. He pulled out a stone and reflected all the hues of the rainbow. The man had discovered the mine of Golconda, the most magnificent diamond mine in all history. Had Ali Hafed remained at home and dug in his own garden, he would have had acres of diamonds instead of experiencing death in a strange land. The more we want, from a human perspective, in a sense, we have less. And that's the argument that Solomon is making. Make your life about Him and being content with Him, working in your life, through your life, pouring out His blessings on your life, pouring out even troubles at times in your life, trusting Him in it. Don't make your life about pleasing people. You'll never be able to do it. You might please some. You'll never please all. And even if you got a bunch following you, eventually they'll stop when they find the new person they want to follow. Right? I want to play a song done by West Coast Baptist College, and it's a good song that I think will help us maybe kind of finish the theme of what he's saying here tonight. This is called For the Cause of Christ.
is to be known for loving Christ, to build his church, to love his bride, and make his name known far and wide. For this cause I live, for this cause I die, I surrender all for the cause of Christ. All I once held dear, I will leave behind, for my joy is this, oh, the cause of Christ. He is all my soul will prize, regardless of the joy or trial. When agonizing questions rise, in Jesus all my hope abides. For this cause I live, for this cause I die, I surrender all for the cause of Christ. All I once held dear, I will leave behind, for my joy is this, oh, the cause of Christ. Jesus, my Jesus, for your glory, for your name. Jesus, my Jesus, I will only sing your praise. Jesus, my Jesus, for your glory, for your name. Jesus, my Jesus, I will only sing your praise. Jesus, my Jesus, for your glory, for your name. Jesus, my Jesus, I will only sing your praise. For this cause I live, for this cause I die, I surrender all for the cause of Christ. All I once held dear, I will leave behind, for my joy is this, oh, the cause of Christ. For my joy is this, oh, the cause of Christ. It is not fame that I desire, nor stature in my brother's eyes. I pray